Irreverent, entertaining, cool. You're listening to LA Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Innervoice with Dr. Foojan Zeine, only on LA Talk Radio.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Foojan Zeine and welcome to The Innervoice show. This show is about making a difference in your life so that you can create a free mind and a heart filled with love toward creating a fulfilling life for yourself and everyone around you. I'll bring you the latest research in the realm of human sciences, and we'll talk to experts in their field to bring you the jewel of their knowledge and wisdom. Before I talk to my guest today, I wanted to tell you about my book, Life Reset, The Awareness Integration Path to Creating a Life You Want. This book is about the latest research psychological model that has been presented to you in a series of exercises, which you can complete in your own time. The Awareness Integration Model has been researched and published with many groups and in many universities, and we presented it at Harvard. And the latest research was done in Cal State Long Beach as a study format, the same way you will have the book. And it actually resulted in 68% decrease in depression and 27% reduction in anxiety. And when the model was done as a psychotherapy model in the therapist room, it created 73% reduction in depression and 68% reduction in anxiety. And raise self-esteem and self-efficacy. So if you want to get the Life Reset book, go to my website, foojan.com, F as in Frank, OOJAN.com. And if you'd like to consult with me, I have my offices in Irvine, Beverly Hills, and Woodland Hills, and I do a lot of consulting online. So again, go to foojan.com. I'd love to hear from you, and if you have other suggestions that you would like to talk to me about, I would love to hear from you. I'll be right back. I'm so excited to have Dr. Peter Levine with me today as my guest. Dr. Peter Levine received his doctorate in medical biophysics from the University of California at Berkeley and another in psychology from International University. Dr. Levine worked for NASA as a stress consultant while the Space Shuttle program was being developed and has shared his expertise while teaching at various facilities throughout the world, including pain clinics, hospitals, and treatment centers. He's particularly interested in the effects of trauma and oppression on indigenous population. He's a member of the World Psychologists for Social Responsibility, an organization dedicated to forming effective responses to ethnic and political warfare and wide-ranging disasters. Dr. Levine is the founder of Somatic Experiencing, and he established a foundation for human enrichment in Boulder, Colorado, to serve as a training facility for somatic experiencing practitioners. Dr. Levine is a faculty member of the Santa Barbara Graduate Institute, and his 1997 book on trauma, Waking the Tiger and Healing Trauma, were the bestsellers. And his latest books are also Trauma and Memory, Brain and Body in a Search for the Living Past, and in an Unspoken Voice, How the Body Releases Trauma and Stores Goodness. Welcome, Dr. Levine, to my show.
Glad to be here.
Dr. Levine, let's first define trauma. So that when we're talking about trauma in the way that you are working with trauma, people understand. Sometimes we've said like the big T and the small t, such as there were small traumas where a person has not necessarily faced death. And, sometimes we call trauma such as accidents or war or famine or something that the person has faced personally, losing their life. Can you explain trauma first, and then we'll go to your books?
Well, it would seem to be simple, but it's not.
Yes.
You kind of hinted there are many different kinds of trauma. And trauma, I guess, is really entombed now in the definition of PTSD. And PTSD includes things like intrusive images, flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, hyperactivation, and triggered by reminders of the past situation. And that certainly is an important definition. In particular, it legitimized the suffering of many of the soldiers coming back from Vietnam, which were basically told that there was a personality disorders they were having, or things like that. So it gave legitimacy, but it also overly narrowed our understanding. I think about trauma in two specific ways, actually. Trauma is when we have perceived, I want to underscore perceived threat, and we mobilize to meet that threat, but we're unable to complete the course of action. And this is the classic fight or flight response. Then we have another type of response, which occurs when we perceive mortal threat, life threat. And what happens there is our body just shuts down. Instead of being hyper-aroused, it becomes hypo-aroused, or shut down, or dissociated, or numb. And when the trauma isn't in the event, it's in how our nervous system, how our bodies, how our minds respond to that threat. So in other words, if something happens and it was really, really scary, if we're able to process that, if we have the support to be able to process that, then it's not going to be a trauma. It's going to be something that happened and we can look back at and acknowledge that it was scary, and maybe also things that we've learned from it. And we're okay. But other times, we don't recover, we don't rebound, we lose that resilience. And this is really where my investigations took me back in the 60s and the 70s. I was curious, because as I started working with people, I discovered that many of their symptoms related to different events that they had in their life and in their adulthood and their childhood. And sometimes they were clearly seemed like something that was absolutely completely overwhelming. Other times it was surprisingly something very simple. Like as a child, they pulled a tablecloth and things came down, plates came down on the floor, and our parents might have yelled at us, and that really scared us. But it also shamed us. And shame is often an important component that occurs in trauma, and it makes trauma kind of virulent. The other response. Where was I? Remind me.
We were talking about the experiences, as I heard you and understand you, about traumas that are life-threatening, where the body experiences a particular one, but also the ones that are perceived threat, such as an example you said, where maybe, our parents fought with us or yelled at us because of a sudden movement that we did or something bad we did as a child, and then they yelled at us, and we hold that as trauma.
Even sometimes the child will have a fall, and the parents, see that, and they run towards the child, and they're scared. They're scared that the child is hurt. So what often comes out is anger. Yeah. But either way, fear or the anger, that can really scare the child in a way more than the event itself. My colleague Maggie Klein and I wrote a book specifically to help parents with kids so that these events can actually increase resilience. Because again, I believe it's a natural aspect of our human organisms, of our nervous systems, and of our bodies, of the unspoken voice of the body. And so
fear, shame, and powerlessness are experiences that many times the person who's been traumatized holds in based on the perception of what has happened to them.
That's right, and often it's also the parent's reaction that what happened to them. Mm-hmm. So again, thinking of the example where the child has a spill, or puts their hand through a window, and the parent again is mortified, and the child sees that, and they pick up the fear of the parent. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we give in trauma proofing your kids are exercises parents can do to help prepare them when their kids have the inevitable fall or spill off a bicycle, and so forth. Mm-hmm. Now, it really became clear that a key factor here was resilience, and I was noticing all of these different things, sometimes seemingly really horrendously major, sometimes more simple or seemingly more benign things like we were just talking about. And I wondered, animals in the wild, animals in the wild are also threatened on a routine basis. Prey animals are. Yes. A rabbit is threatened. A gazelle is threatened on the plains of the Serengeti. Yet they, from my observations in the wild, in animals in the wild, didn't seem to develop trauma. Certainly not in a routine way. And that only made sense in a way, because if they did experience trauma every time that they were chased down and escaped, then the likelihood of them escaping the next time would be greatly diminished. Yes. Because you would lose your edge, and then so the animal wouldn't survive, nor would the species. So it occurred to me, there must be something, an innate capacity that we all have, animals as well as us, which we are also animals, mammals, that gives us this natural immunity, this resilience. But why was it that people seem to have lost that or not had access to it, whereas the animals readily did? And I discovered some of it was the very sensations that bring us back out of a potentially traumatizing event. They're body sensations. And those sensations are frightening to people because we're not used to them, because they are irrational, they're primitive, they can be intense, and so we block them. And in blocking those sensations, we actually block this natural resilience of rebounding from the trauma. Now, the good news is that this can happen retroactively. So even though you were traumatized and didn't have the resilience then, in Somatic Experiencing, we help clients access that innate capacity, that innate resilience. So those were really some of the most important influences in my studies were animal ethology, the study of animals in their natural environments, and the neuroscience of the day, and then of course my clinical work with clients that I was starting to develop in the 1970s up until today. So maybe that gives you kind of an overview.
Yes. I have watched you at the Erickson's conference last December. Watched you work, and I've watched your videos. And one of the most amazing thing that I saw in that very, very small and minute expressions of the body, you were holding very dear, and you were allowing the body to talk to the person and you as the clinician as you were working with them. And I recall I've been traumatized as a child, and I know that many of the clients that I've worked with would have been traumatized. Their body holds some sort of an expression and a memory, while they might choose to to selectively remember the memory or not, even suppress it in a way that they even think it didn't happen. And then yet their body starts behaving a particular way and holds that type of a memory consistently. Like, I remember I was sexually abused from age 3 to 8. And I remember while I was working with hypnosis that both of my arms, as I was going through the memory, became fully numb again, completely numb in the locations that they were held, where it was frightening, like what you just said. When the body sensation comes, it is so frightening because it's so out of control again. And while at the time of the trauma, obviously I was holding back in being in my body and having those sensations, going back as I was going through the memory, all of these physical sensations showed up. So, and then I watched you work with your clients, seeing that even very, very minute, like even if the person would not remember or could not even go and fathom what it was and all the details of the memory, you started looking at the way they were holding their hands at that moment or holding their feet at that moment, and you allowed their body to start talking about it. Can you speak to that, please?
Sure. A couple of things. First of all, we never take the person headlong into a trauma. It's always gently revisiting it rather than reliving it. The body remembers where the mind has forgotten. And trauma is something that happens primarily in the body. We talked a little bit about this just before. We stiffen, we contract, we constrict, we collapse. These are all things that the body does. And that is in a sense, that is the memory of the trauma, because it's not a conscious memory. So if we were frightened, our shoulders may have, gone up towards our ears and stayed there. So the trauma that may have occurred decades ago keeps replaying itself in the body, in the present, and that keeps it from possibly being in the now. So in somatic experience, we really see how the trauma is held in the body. But there's another aspect, because the body also has, miraculously, holds the antidote also for the trauma. I remember working, for example, with this woman who was in the 72nd floor of the World Trade Center in the North Tower when the plane crashed. And she was, as you can imagine, horribly, horribly traumatized. And as I have her describe the day starting from her home and taking the ferry to New York, I noticed her hands make a gesture, her arms and hands make a gesture very slightly of opening. And I don't bring her attention to it that time, but it happens a second time, and then I bring her attention to it. And her mind is thinking about the trauma, but her body is talking about the beautiful day it was. The sky was perfectly clear and blue. She was going across the ferry. Life was just beautiful. So she was able to, in a sense, go between that experience and the horror that she experienced in the building and in eventually escaping, and then when the second building crashed, being blown on top of a dead person. So she was able to do all of this, and her body portrayed, as I say, both the specific memory, that is to say the procedural memory, the body memory, of what happened to the person, well, of their entire history, really, but again, of sensations and feelings that contradict those of fear and helplessness. One of the things that I also discovered is that because trauma is something that happens in the body, that really the antidote for body is having new experiences in the body, being able to cultivate new experiences in the body, and the body is, as you pointed out, are always giving us hints, or always giving us messages, like tracking an animal in the snow. We see its footprints and we follow it. We see where it may have slept or rested for a while because there's indentation of the snow, and we just follow that to where it gives us this new experience of empowerment, of mastery, of self-compassion, of dignity. And again, these are things that come in the unspoken voice of the body. And again, that was, as you mentioned, the title of one of my two more recent books, In an Unspoken Voice, How the Body Releases Trauma and Restores Goodness, just what we were talking about. And then how the trauma gets locked in the body as body memories, as procedural memories, and how we can help the person complete those memories and come back into aliveness. I give an example, the first chapter in An Unspoken Voice. I was walking to go to a restaurant, and a teenager went through a stop sign and hit me in a crosswalk. I was thrown into the air and landed thrown into the windshield and then thrown onto the ground. I was literally out of my body. I was looking from above down at my body. And a woman came by, and she announced herself as a doctor, a pediatrician. I remember thinking, I think that's exactly the specialty I need right now. And she asked if there's anything she could do to help. And I said, please stay with me. And she kneeled down and held my hands. And when she did that, I was able to go through the things that my body was doing to protect myself. I could feel my left arm and hand going up and protecting my head from hitting the windshield as though we're in slow motion. I could feel myself flying in the air. I could also feel my right hand pushing out against the road so that my head didn't hit the road. And then I felt emotions of anger, of rage in my body, as intense sensations hard to even describe the sensation, but the intensity of the sensation. And I allowed that to move through my body. And as a result of that, she had taken my blood pressure, or my pulse. And when I was in the ambulance going to the emergency room, they were startled that my pulse was normal, my blood pressure was normal, and the paramedic said, we never see anything like this. The person's usually their blood pressure and their heart rate are sky high. And I took the opportunity to explain what I did and told her, that we have training programs for paramedics. I never miss an opportunity to proselytize. So again, the things that my body was doing to protect itself, in appreciation and a gratefulness of my body for doing what it did at that time. Mm-hmm. So again, that's an example of this unspoken voice renegotiating these traumatic memories which are lodged in the body as body memories, as so-called procedural memories.
When you say that, I remember working with a client where we did a lot of the trauma, and she was physically abused by her father, her aunt, and everyone. Keep going through those experiences. I remember for many times she would go and cry and cry and cry. And at one point, she started shaking. Her whole body started shaking. And then she asked me to come in and hold her hands. And as you know, usually in therapy we don't touch unless it is requested, or like you said, She asked me to hold her hands, and I held both her hands while she completed her shaking, and that was pretty much the last session of the trauma. as you explained. I wanted to also read for our listeners from your book, Trauma and Memory, Brain and Body in Search for Living Past, especially when you talked about procedural memory. In your chapter 3, you say, procedural memories are the impulses, movements, and internal body sensations that guide us through the how-to of our various actions, skills, attractions, and repulsions. They can be divided into 3 broad categories, which you say, one, learned motor activities and actions such as dancing, skiing, bike riding, and all of that. And the other category, the emergency responses that call upon our basic survival instinct in the face of the threat. And the third one would be the memories in the fundamental organismic response tendencies of approach or avoidance of attraction and repulsion. Because you had said the procedural memories, and I just wanted the listeners to know what you meant by that. And that's in your book, Trauma and Memory.
Yes. Again, procedural memories in general are things that we learn, that our body learns. So if we want to learn the tango, we have to learn it. And we do it thousands of times until our body actually gets it. Probably for me, 100,000 times. Learning to ride a bicycle. That's a really good example. The child is on the bicycle, the parent or the older sibling is by her side and walking with her and then running with her, and then boom, she rides the bike, steers it, and stops it for the first time, and she learns very quickly. The expression, you never forget to learn to ride a bicycle. Yes. Once you've learned. Well, it's true, and that's true of various procedural memories, but especially those that have to do with threat and self-protection. We have to learn them very quickly. Unfortunately, it's also difficult, or it can be difficult, to unlearn them unless we're given the right guidance and the right support. As you said, the types of memories that we have of procedural memories of when our life was threatened, if that program stays in execution, we still experience that threat as though it's happening right now, as though it's happening in the present. And once we allow those responses to complete, like I mentioned, and you mentioned with your client, of my self-protective responses when I was hit by the car, of the kinds of giving the support to a person so that they can move through these incompleted responses, complete them, and to discharge the energy that's locked in them. There's a video of a gazelle being chased by a cheetah, and the cheetah brings down the gazelle, and this race goes on at about 65 miles an hour, and the cheetah the cheetah is chewing on the gazelle. The gazelle looks, of course, dead, and something distracts the cheetah, and in that moment, the gazelle flips over and takes off, and it continues what it was doing, which was running, and then it was taken down. But then when it comes out of the immobility, all of that energy is redirected into the escape response. But with people, that we don't. The trauma is that we don't actually make that escape, and so that energy gets locked in, and instead of coming out and running, it can come out in shaking and trembling to take that energy, that high energy of activation, and discharge it into balance, into self-regulation. And sometimes people, like the woman who I saw in 1969 that really basically set me in the direction that I would spend my life studying trauma and the healing of trauma, that she was suffering from all kinds of symptoms. which we would now call fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, irritable bowel, so forth. And in our session, she felt completely frozen, and I said, Nancy, there's a tiger. It crouched, ready to spring and chase you. Run, see those rocks, run, climb the rocks, and escape. And to our amazement, by the way, she also, of course, was suffering from panic attacks and agoraphobia. She could barely leave the house, only with her husband accompanying her. And to both of our surprises, her body started to shake and tremble in waves. Her hands would be freezing cold and then warm. She would take deep, spontaneous breaths. And at the end of the session, she said that she could see the image of the tiger, which I suggested. She could feel herself trying to run, but her legs are like lead. And she said when I continued to encourage her, she finally could feel her body running, climbing the rocks, sitting up there and shaking and trembling. And then looking down, and instead of seeing the tiger, she saw herself as a 4-year-old child being held down for an ether tonsillectomy, with the mask terrifying her, being placed on her face and feeling a terror of suffocation. And by making this escape, as it were, retroactively, that was the last panic attack, and we did a few more sessions, and her physical symptoms either greatly improved or disappeared. And again, that was the event that told me that the rest of my life would be dedicated to solving the mystery of trauma, the mystery of what happened to Nancy that day and to happen to so many, many, many people.
You have spoken in the Trauma and Memory book in how the increasing threat to take someone from an alert or from an equilibrium to an alert and all the way down to freeze and fold. And then you also suggest that renegotiation is the path that the body will take it back, which is the renegotiation, not just simply reliving the traumatic experience, but the gradual and revisiting of a various sensory motor elements comprising a particular trauma engram. So the renegotiation would be assessing the procedural memories associated with two of the dysregulated states of autonomic nervous system, the overwhelm and then the shutdown. And at this progress, to bring them into completion so that the client can move, or the person can move from the hypo alert and arousal, from the overwhelm toward the equilibrium and relaxed state. And that, in essence, is the renegotiation that happens as the person goes through a trauma to healing of it and releasing of it and letting it go. And this is something that you were just explaining in the experience, from one space to the other.
Yeah, the key is in renegotiation, which is a revisiting. It's definitely not a reliving. Let's look what happens, to the gazelle or to a person. Let's just say we're in a relaxed state, a relaxed and alert state, and then we observe some novelty in the environment. We don't know what it is yet, so our attention kind of focuses towards looking for that source, and either to approach it, if it's a source of nourishment or mating, or avoid it if it's a source of potential threat or danger. And so we go from relaxed alertness to orientation, to assessment. Well, to arrest, we stop our movements, we assess whether it's approach or avoidance. Then we go to mobilization for responding to threat through an energetic action, such as fighting or fleeing. If that is unsuccessful, or if we're overwhelmed, then we go into the life threat shutdown state. Just as we go in step by step, it is possible, and that diagram that I have in the book, I think actually it's an excellent diagram, really conveys so much, shows that how we actually go from shutdown, then to hyperarousal, then to regulation and reorientation, and here and now presence in our environment. So as we go in, so we can go out. And which brings me kind of to my life statement, which is trauma is a fact of life. It affects really, to some degree, all of us, if not directly through people we care about. But the good news is it doesn't have to be a life sentence, and I think this diagram shows the steps that we can take that move us out of trauma back into aliveness and vitality. Because the energy that's locked in trauma, really that energy is life energy. It's the healthy aggression. It's our ability to go and to have the motivation and the energy to get what we need in life and to make our life successful.
And you speak about the therapeutic exploration, or when someone is healing themselves, they're also creating an inner strength and bringing and having the capacity to have healthy aggression. Can you talk about healthy aggression? Because I know the word aggression usually it has a negative connotation for everyone.
Yes. Aggression has been given a bad rap. A very unfortunate bad rap.
As you see the world, you can see why it was given a bad rap.
Right. Actually, especially for women. If you say, "Oh, this woman is aggressive,"
yeah,
it really has a negative connotation. And aggression, as I said, is what we need to carry out our life to get what we need. And usually, when that's blocked, that's when we tend to be. I don't want to use the term aggressive. We tend either to bully or to, something like that, or to force something on somebody else. But that's not what healthy aggression at all is about. It really is about knowing what we want and directing our actions in that direction. And we need our life energy, access to our life energy to do that. And if our life energy is tied up with trauma, then we're not able to do that. So the restoration of healthy aggression is a key component in healing from trauma.
So when you, for our listeners who are listening, if you could say, if they have had a trauma where they wanted to shut it down, not think about it, it overwhelms them on a daily life at this time, what would you suggest for them to realize, and what would be some simple steps before they go to therapy, or whether they choose to go to therapy or counseling or not? What are some of the simple steps that they could use at home in recognizing or renegotiating or regulating what's going on with them?
Well, first of all, to find some part in their body that feels less threatened, or less pain, if it's a physical sensation, and to shift back and forth a little bit between that part of the body that's less frightening and the part that's more frightening, and to do that a few times. Also, to know that there's a fundamental law that I call the law of pendulation. And basically, every living animal exhibits these behaviors, including as far as back as the amoeba. We are either in a state of contracting or expanding at any moment, contracting or expanding. When the trauma comes up, we are in a state of contracting. If we can focus on that in a softer way, such as, for example, shifting back and forth between the more positive sensations in our body and the trauma-based sensations. We can do that, then person will start to notice that they start to expand. But of course, every expansion is followed again by a contraction, but this time by a larger expansion. So gradually going into this rhythm of pendulation, of contraction and expansion. And, I think it's important to have somebody there, somebody that you trust, and that it's a clear relationship you have with them. There's not a lot of unfinished business with that person. Having a person there, just being there, witnessing it, is also important. Just like that pediatrician was for me, even though I'd been, this is something at a time I've been developing for over 35 years. In order for me to actually utilize my principles, it was really important to have somebody there. And of course, I can never say more about, finding a good trauma-informed therapist. If people want, they can always go to my organization's website, which is traumahealing.org, and it lists practitioners and training programs and so forth. And you can most likely find somebody in your area. Even though I had that experience, where I recovered from the car crash, I still did a few sessions with some colleagues just to make sure everything was clear. So, I think it's a gift that we can give to ourselves to get the help that we need to bring us back into life and vibrancy.
Now, for other traumas which are more perceived, such as the one you spoke about, which I think most people have some of those, because we've all been raised and we've all did not have the perfect parents who at every moment knew how to be with us. So obviously, the same as when we're a parent, we do what we can at the best moment, the way we know. So most of us have some traumatic memories about letting our parents down, or feeling shame, or feeling powerless against whatever was happening in our childhood as we were growing up. And how do we handle some of those traumas, which are not necessarily as big as the ones that we have faced a traumatic event which was physical, or it has been a threat of mortality?
Yeah. Well, shame is a particular bodily response. It involves disgust. It involves a collapsing of the spine, a collapsing around the diaphragm. It could be ever so slight, but it's going to be there. I found the biggest, most useful approach to working with shame, either with a therapist or with ourselves, is to become aware of how our body is in that collapsed position. Instead of trying to pull away from it, to actually go into it a little bit more, and then to come back out of it. So feeling ourselves, unfortunately this is not a video, but a little bit collapsing more with our bodies, and then coming back up, lengthening our spine, then going a little bit into that collapse and coming back into lengthening. And it's really amazing when we do that 2 or 3 times. Very often we're able to look back at this event and say, oh my gosh, that wasn't my fault, or I didn't need to feel the shame, or maybe the other person needed to feel more of their shame, the person who scolded us. And we forgive ourselves in a way for having kept ourselves feeling the shame, when in a way it was so simple, in a way, to come out of it. I mean, I'm talking about something that's not part of the most horrific trauma, but some thing where we were ashamed or we were betrayed by our parents in some way. And of course, nobody's going to get through life without being betrayed in some way by their parents. And again, the child experiences this betrayal as shame. And so working with the physiology of the shame, with the posture of the shame, in a similar way that we do work with trauma, touching into it, coming out of it, touching into it, coming out of it, will very often give us a different, at least give us a different relationship to our shame, and to be able to look at it in a self-compassionate way.
Dr. Levine, does this also have to do with kind of a desensitization? Because as you go into the contraction and then to the expansion, and then when you've experienced your strength, whether it's in your body or psyche or the emotions or the thought process that shows up, and then going back into the contraction, does that like desensitize you more, but coming from the strength and then going back and expanding more? Because it seems like the body shifting back and forth and going, which is the physiology of the experience that you have from your powerlessness to your strength and powerlessness to strength. It seems like every time you go back into the powerlessness, that's where the renegotiation somehow happens. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. Actually, I mean, if I'm talking to a cognitive and behavioral therapist, I use the word desensitization because that's the word they're familiar with and comfortable with. But I don't use that word really, although you could, because in desensitization doesn't necessarily bring us to our strength and to our power. It's reducing the effect that a certain trigger might have on us. So, and of course, we work with at times with something that looks like desensitization, but working with the empowerment through contraction expansion, it's much more complex and nuanced than simple desensitization. But there's nothing wrong with using the term. Mm-hmm. And again, if you're able to help the person read what's going on in the body, even if you're doing desensitization, when you enlist the body, the unspoken voice of the body, then these other characteristics of power, of strength, of healthy aggression, of vitality are likely to occur, which would be quite different than desensitization. So again, that's why I use the term renegotiation versus revisiting, versus reliving or desensitization.
Right. So the word desensitization only explains maybe a minute component of it, but the whole concept is much more complex in the way that you bring the person, shifting it and gaining the resilience and strength, and then bringing their side of the strength and resilience toward the part of them that is more vulnerable, right?
Yes, exactly. It's more complex, it's more empowering, and it gives greater resilience. I think you probably get some increase in resilience with desensitization, but this works at a much deeper level.
Yes.
It works from, and that's again why the title of the book, In an Unspoken Voice, it looks at bottom-up processing rather than top-down processing, which is more what desensitization is about.
So your latest book, In an Unspoken Voice, How the Body Releases Trauma and Restores Goodness, and then the latest one, which is Trauma and Memory, Brain and Body in a Search for a Living Past, a practical guide for understanding and working with traumatic memory. And they're both available at Amazon, because I bought both of them. Actually, I bought them at the conference, but they're available at Amazon. If our listeners want to find you, where could they find you? What would be your...
Well, they can go to my institute's website, which is traumahealing.org.
Great.
And then I have my own website. It's called somaticexperiencing.com. And I think some of the different events that I do that are open to most of my teaching is with postgraduate classes for for the trainees of my program, but I do a number of public events, and I think they're on the somaticexperiencing.com website. I'm doing a few events in the Bay Area, one with PESI, one with California Institute of Integral Studies on Trauma and Spirituality, and at Spirit Rock on meditation and trauma and meditation.
It's beautiful.
So I think those are all on the Somatic Experiencing website.
Thank you so much for spending the time with me and our audience and listeners. I've always learned a lot from you, and I hope to keep learning. And as you write your next books and your research, we would love to have you back on my show.
Oh, great. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. And for all of you who are listening with your heart, thank you so much for being with us, and create a wonderful, amazing life minute for yourself and everyone around you. So until next week, take good care of yourself. Bye-bye.
You're listening to The Inner Voice with Dr. Foojan Zeine, only on LA Talk Radio.